Hello everyone, and welcome to another quick cut rate commander precon upgrade guide, the semi-regular series in which we give precon decks a quick glow up without breaking the bank. My name's Grazzet, and today we'll be giving the Fallout Universes Beyond Mutant Menace Precon $35 worth of upgrades to bring it up to cut rate standards. As usual though, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content. Consider supporting the channel directly either via my Buy Me a Coffee or my Game Nerds affiliate link in the description if you really like it, and be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see what precon upgrades we'll be covering next. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. This deck's face commander is the Wise Mothman, a 3/3 flying insect mutant that costs 1 in soul tie that has the following 2 abilities. Firstly, whenever the Wise Mothman enters the battlefield or attacks, each player gets a rad counter. And secondly, whenever 1 or more non-land cards are milled, we put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to X creatures, where X is the number of non-land cards milled this way. Sporting a mid-weight CMC and a slightly below average but evasive stat block for his cost, the Wise Mothman's abilities establish him as both a counter and mill-centric commander, enabling him to consistently spread the new rad counters across the table as he ETBs and swings in, and once our opponents mill cards due to those counters or through any other mill sources, he converts those milled cards into +1/+1 counters to both empower himself and our other creatures so they can crack in even harder. And the base deck helps enable this game plan incredibly well, including even more ways to distribute rad counters onto our opponents to mill and deal damage to them even faster, as well as a small suite of rad counter payoffs to generate us value or utility as we irradiate our opponents, +1/+1 counter generating cards and payoffs to further empower and benefit from our commander's counter distribution, and capping off with a decent selection of proliferation sources so we can multiply our rad and +1/+1 counters across the table even faster. In fact, the base build has very few quote-unquote misses at all, with only a handful of the legendary entrants included being a bit off theme, but can still easily be run since they still contribute to the +1/+1 counter portion of our game plan, and even some of the deck's weaker entrants still being perfectly serviceable in the build, making this deck, in my opinion, probably the best to run out of the box as is. That said, there is still some room for improvement, so in this upgrade, we'll be aiming to improve what the deck is already good at by adding in more repeatable proliferation sources to allow us to multiply our counters at an even faster pace, alongside more +1/+1 counter-centric cards to generate us more value as our commander loads up our creatures with them, as well as adding in some powerful standalone sources of mill and mill payoffs to proc our commander more often and generate us more value as we do so, along with some graveyard recursion sources that will allow us to get any resources we mill back from the bin, thereby ensuring that the Wise One will be able to bestow his flock with the wisdom necessary to thwart their heretical brethren. So let us make our way to Appalachia, where the Enlightened are preparing their yearly festival to honor the Wise Mothman, whose visions of incoming disaster had supposedly saved their cult from the incoming nukes by guiding them to the Lucky Hole mine before they fell. Now, whether this story is true or not, there is no denying that these cultists do seem to be communicating with something during the Mothman equinox, a purple-eyed Mothman who does not seem to wish them any harm but simply observes. But whether he be a simple mutant or something more, that's for the Vault Dweller to decide. So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's jump straight into the upgrades. Starting things off with the new proliferation sources we'll be adding to the build in order to further augment the number of counters we'll be distributing onto our creatures and onto our opponents, we'll be cutting Cathedral Acolyte, whose AoE Ward 1 and conditional +1/+1 counter distribution are a bit too underwhelming to warrant running, in favor of Thrumming Bird, whose on-damage proliferate on an evasive body makes it both fantastic at multiplying our counters, and to load up with counters so it can hit even harder as it does so. Swapping out Tireless Tracker, whose landfall-based clue token generation is okay, but falls short in comparison to our other card advantage generating sources already in the deck, and that we'll be adding. For Evolution Sage, whose landfall proliferate is a much better fit here as another way for us to consistently multiply our counters as we make our land drops. And retiring Lily Bowen, Raging Grandma, who's certainly an interesting self-growing threat, but one that takes a bit too long to grow into one, so we can make space for Canker Bloom, which can function as a one-time source of proliferate, or, if we need removal instead, we can use it to pop back row with its artifact and enchantment destroying modes. Then moving on to our new +1/+1 counter-centric additions that can both produce and provide benefits from said counters, we'll be cutting down Harold and Bob, First Newmans, who are not very reliable in this build due to us only having 5 forests for them to enchant and requiring them to die first to provide us with any benefit. Firing Piper Wright, Public Reporter, who would be a much better fit in a clue-focused deck that would be able to make her evasive more reliably so she can generate more clues, and scrapping Strength Bobblehead, which, like all the other bobbleheads, really needs to be part of the full set in order for us to get the maximum value out of it. So we can make space for Kami of Whispered Hopes, Incubation Druid, and Gyre Sage, all of which provide us with ramp to speed up and or fix our mana base that only gets better as we get +1/+1 counters on them, with the former also increasing the rate at which all our other creatures accumulate +1/+1 counters to make them even bigger, and replacing the generic draw spell Harmonize and the bit too slow draw source Vault 87 Forced Evolution, with the more on-theme draw sources Danny Pink and Fathom Mage, which generate us reliable and repeatable card advantage in this build as they and or our other creatures accumulate counters to ensure our hands remain nice and full as we play into our primary game plan. Now, with all our new counter-focused additions covered, let's move on to the pure mill-focused entries we'll be adding to proc the Wise Mothman and all our other mill-focused payoffs more often, in which we'll be replacing Fraying Sanity, which is admittedly a serviceable mill source, with the better mill source Mind Crank, which is cheaper than its predecessor and overcharges our rad counter's ability to mill by forcing our opponents to mill more as they mill non-lands, on top of also forcing them to mill whenever they lose life from any source to grow our creatures even faster and to proc our payoffs more frequently, releasing Watchful Radstag, which is a combo-tastic creature that can produce an infinite number of copies of itself with the right support, sadly none of which are available in this build to enable it, so we'll be slotting in Mesmeric Orb in its place, which turns every single permanent anyone taps into more individual instances of mill, including their lands, allowing our commander to again grow our creatures even faster, and, unlike mass mill effects, lets us stack counters on our creatures to grow individual ones at a breakneck pace. And lastly, we'll be replacing Lumbering Megasloth, which is flavorfully a bit too slow in this build, with Ruin Crab, whose AoE mill as we make our land drops gives us a bit of extra reach to empower our creatures and proc our other mill-centric payoffs more reliably. And speaking of mill payoffs, we'll also be slotting in a few of those into the build in order to provide us with some additional value alongside our commander, in which we'll be raising the bad land Temple of the False God in order to slot in Zellic Sanity Flare, who can also provide repeatable mill himself if we have the mana to spare, but we're primarily running as a way for us to turn any creatures our opponents mill into creature tokens for ourselves to grow our board with, replacing the land cycling Land Ash Barrens with the quest counter accumulating Blood Chief Ascension, which can come online very quickly once we get a single counter on it thanks to all our proliferation sources, and, once it does so, tax on life drain to every single card our opponents mill so we can eliminate them even faster while keeping ourselves alive, and slotting out the too slow creature recurring land Mortuary Mire so we can slot in Sir Conrad the Grim, who also converts all our forced mill into damage, this time by turning any creatures anyone mills into AoE enemy only burn, as well as being a mill-based mana sink himself to force even more milling if we have the mana to pump into him. And then, in order to take advantage of all the mill we'll be forced to do thanks to our commander and our less discriminating mill sources, we'll be adding in a suite of graveyard recursion sources to the build to let us take advantage of the cards we'll be sending to our bin, in which we'll be replacing the bit too underpowered board wipe Find and Finality, the decent but too specific Lord Hancock Ghoulish Mayor, and the too sack-focused Jason Bright Glowing Prophet, with the graveyard card recurring Timeless Witness, Dryad's Revival, and Creeping Renaissance, units, all of which we can play from our bin if we mill them thanks to Eternalize and Flashback respectively, or let us use them twice if we draw into them for even more recursion, as well as cutting the off-theme Mass Pump spell Biomass Mutation, and the on-theme but lackluster Graveyard Centric Young Death Claws in order to open space for Eternal Witness and Muldrotha the Gravetide, which provide even more graveyard recursion as they ETB or simply exist, incentivizing us to load ourselves up with rad counters so we can empower our board with impunity while still having access to all our most powerful spells even if we mill them. And as our last upgrade, we'll be giving our core stats a bit of a glow up by replacing the multi-targeting but expensive removal spell Casualties of War with the cheaper and more flexible Beast Within, which can deal with more kinds of threats at flash speed in order to make our removal suite just a bit more efficient. So, now that we've covered all 20 cards we've upgraded from the core build, let's take a look at the breakdown for this Precon upgrade. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 19 sources of rad counters and 14 sources of +1/+1 counters to get our primary counter-centric game plan rolling, 5 cards that care about rad counters, 9 cards that care about +1/+1 counters, and 4 cards that care about any types of counters to get additional utility out of all our counter distribution sources, 11 sources of proliferate so we can get even more counters onto our creatures and to our opponents, 11 sources of mill outside of rad counters, and 10 cards that care about cards being milled to supplement the rate at which we proc our commander and to give us more payoffs for said mill to work alongside him, and lastly, 8 sources of graveyard recursion so we can make use of the cards we mill from the bin. For general deck stats, we have 12 ramp sources, 10 card draw sources, 9 targeted removal sources, and 1 board wipe. Our removal being slightly below average in this build, but is made up for by the build's multiple ways to protect our creatures from destruction, and the fact that we can get multiple uses out of our removal thanks to all our graveyard recursion. Looking at our mana curve, we have an average CMC of 3.23, leaving us with a mid-weight curve that wants to make a beeline for our commander as quickly as possible so we can start irradiating the table with rad counters ASAP, followed by more creatures to spread our +1/+1 counters to as we end our opponent's mill cards. Then from there, it's just a matter of us getting more sources of rad counters and standalone mill sources into play to proc our commander's +1/+1 counter distribution more often, other payoffs to take advantage of our counter distribution and mill to generate us even more value or to damage our opponents even further, and using our graveyard recursion sources to generate value from our bin from the cards we mill, until our opponents finally succumb to our massive creatures and their radiation poisoning. The final price of this build then comes out to be $80.18 after upgrades. This price does not include tax or shipping and assumes that the price you paid for the Precon was $45. The price of the cards was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Now, if we want to add even more upgrades by going over budget, we can perform a modest upgrade to the build by swapping out Nightkin Ambusher for Bruvak the Grandiloquent, who supercharges all our mill sources by doubling the amount they mill to make all our mill payoffs twice as effective, a substantial upgrade to the build by replacing Strong the Brutish Thespian for Vorn Kleck's Monstrous Raider, who doubles all our rad and +1/+1 counter distribution sources with his mere presence on the battlefield, on top of also hosing any opponents with counter distribution effects of their own by making them half as effective, and, somehow even more expensive than that, we can trade out Contaminated Drink for my eternal nemesis, the Great Henge, which functionally gives us another copy of Guardian Project to draw us more cards as we cast our creatures, we can often cast for 2 thanks to all our counter distribution sources, and ramps us and distributes +1/+1 counters for us and gains us more life on top of that, all while White cries in the corner because it never gets nice things apparently. Okay, fair point. Maybe not crying that hard, but the Great Henge is still busted though. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. So, with the Mutant Menace Precon upgrade complete, the next and final Precon upgrade we'll be tinkering with will be the Science Precon and its face commander, Dr. Madison Lee, so look forward to that build coming soon. That said, we still have our poll running in the community tab to see which one of the alternate commanders from the Fallout Precons will get to have a build of their own, those being the aura-focused Preston Garvey Minuteman, the dice-rolling Mr. House President and CEO, the mutant milling the Master Transcendent, and the energy-hungry robot Liberty Prime Recharged. So be sure to cast your votes, link in the description, before the deadline on March 8th, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and which commanders from this set you'd like to see me feature in future polls. And again, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy this content. Consider donating to buy me a coffee or use my Game Nerds affiliate link if you want to support the channel directly. And if you'd like to see more videos like this one, either click on the videos floating around my head for the latest builds, or click on the card above for a playlist of all the deck techs I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.